So I want to step back a little bit for a few moments and describe some of the drivers that led to this final reform of TSCA after 40 years. What caused it to get onto the national agenda and actually cause Congress to act? Well, the first thing is simply the fact that chemicals are everywhere, and increasingly there are questions being raised about their safety. About 10 trillion pounds of chemicals are produced every year in the U.S. And you can imagine wearing a 90-pound backpack on your back, and then at the end of the day, putting that one aside, and the next morning picking up another one. That is literally how much in the form of chemicals that are regulated under TSCA we produce and use every day. They're used to make just about everything around us. 96% is an estimate. That excludes a few things like wood and other natural materials, but just about everything we touch and use is made of synthetic chemicals regulated by TSCA. Now, we don't actually know how many chemicals are in U.S. commerce, but we have some ballpark figures. We know that 85,000 chemicals have been in commerce at some point since TSCA originally passed in 1976. We know that not all of those are in commerce today, but we don't know how many actually are. In fact, when TSCA passed in 1976, there were about 62,000 chemicals on the market, and those were put onto what is called the TSCA inventory. And then 23,000 new chemicals were added at a rate of between 500 and 1,000 a year. So there really are a lot of new chemicals coming into market, replacing old ones, and some of the old ones simply are no longer being used. So we'll get to how TSCA reform deals with getting a better handle on that in a moment. Some of the reasons why TSCA reform suddenly became a priority for the Congress is because of a series of findings in scientific research that began to connect the dots between our use of chemicals and diseases that are on the rise in the human population. We know that certain diseases, such as certain childhood cancers, infertility, asthma, reproductive effects, are all on the rise. And they're on the rise in a manner that really can only be explained as a result of environmental factors. And increasingly, there's evidence that chemical exposures are one of those factors. We know that because in laboratory studies and sometimes even in human epidemiological studies, certain chemicals have been linked to the same diseases that are on the rise in the human population. And finally, we now know that many of those same chemicals actually are in our bodies. We have been exposed to them through the products we use, through the food and air and water that we consume. Those chemicals can be found now in our blood. Some of the diseases that I mentioned before that have been linked in scientific studies to direct chemical exposures include this really long list. Many of the major chronic effects in humans that we worry about and that we are doing a lot to try to reduce, chemicals have a role. It's often hard to quantify. Some chemicals have a very strong link, other ones less clear. However, increasingly there's a worry that the use and widespread nature of chemical exposures is resulting in health effects in the human population. We know that in part because we better understand how chemicals get from where they're being used or made to our bodies. We know now that chemicals can be transported very long distances. For example, the Arctic regions of the world actually have some of the highest concentrations of certain synthetic chemicals. And they got there not because people are using products containing them, but because those chemicals were released to the environment and then transported long distances through the air or the water, and also through the contamination of wildlife that moves long distances as well. So marine mammals in the Arctic have some of the highest concentrations of certain synthetic chemicals found on Earth. We know that chemicals can get out of products that they're used in and into the environment and into people. And let me just mention two brief examples. You know, if you go out on a parking lot and you look at the surface of that, it's often sealed with a very dark or black coating that is intended to keep rainwater out and make that driveway last longer. Well, it turns out that those sealants contain chemicals, and those chemicals don't just stay put. They actually run off into water during rain events, and they are actually now known to be picked up by one's shoes when you walk across a parking lot or your driveway, and they are brought into your house and end up as a contaminant in the dust in your house. And this has now been scientifically shown by researchers at the U.S. Geological Survey to be a significant source of exposure to some very dangerous chemicals, chemicals we know cause cancer in people. The other example are so-called brominated flame retardants that have been used for a number of decades in the furniture that we sit on, in the upholstered furniture, and it's specifically put into the foam as an effort to try to reduce the fire risk should that furniture catch on fire. What we now know, however, is they don't just sit in that foam. They actually are emitted or released from the foam over time. As that foam, every time you sit on it and compress it, a little bit of dust comes out through the upholstery, and that dust is laden with these brominated flame retardants. And we know from animal studies and sometimes now human studies that some of those chemicals can adversely affect our health. We also know that we're not all exposed to chemicals at the same level or in the same way. In fact, some people are more exposed than others because of where they live, what kinds of products they buy and can afford to buy, and other factors like that that are differential across the population. And this is part of a much broader set of issues that goes under the words environmental justice, because some people who live in poor neighborhoods, in substandard housing, less access to health care and the like, may also suffer from disproportionate exposures to chemicals from the environment and even from products that they use. We know some of this because of advances in science that include the ability to actually monitor human beings for the presence of chemicals in our bodies. And this is called biomonitoring, and the advent of that really goes back a couple of decades. But the more chemicals that we have looked at, and we do so through a government program that looks at several thousand people every couple of years, the more chemicals we look for, the more we find. And we know that some of those chemicals are in fact toxic. So that is another connecting of the dots here, that those chemicals that are in use, that are linked to diseases, are actually being found in our bodies. And finally, there's a large body of evidence that suggests that probably the most vulnerable period of time to be exposed to chemicals is during very early life. In utero, a pregnant woman who's exposed to chemicals can pass some of those chemicals through the placenta to her developing fetus. And in early infancy, when children's metabolism is changing, when many of its systems are being developed, its neurodevelopmental system, its immune system, and so forth, chemical exposures during that window of vulnerability can be particularly troubling.